For several days, the timeline did not make sense. Schedules were published, plans were confirmed, and expectations were quietly set. From the outside, everything appeared routine. A public figure was expected to be in one place, preparing for a professional obligation that had been discussed for weeks. Nothing about the arrangement suggested disruption. There were no warnings, no visible signs of change, and no indication that anything unusual was unfolding behind the scenes. Then, without explanation, the appearance never happened. There was no announcement, no public delay, just a brief message sent privately, offering apologies and promising follow-up at a later time. At first, this seemed unremarkable. In modern media, last-minute changes are common. Travel issues happen, personal matters arise. Most people moved on without a second thought. But within hours, small inconsistencies began to surface. A flight that was said to be delayed could not be found in public records. A location that had been referenced did not match independent tracking data. And a quiet absence, which initially felt like a scheduling issue, started to look more deliberate. What followed was not a sudden revelation, but a slow accumulation of unanswered questions. Observers noted that communications went silent at the same time movements appeared elsewhere. Security activity, usually predictable, appeared slightly altered. Nothing on its own seemed alarming. Taken together, it suggested a change in direction. This is where the situation began to shift. Online discussion forums started connecting details that had not previously been linked. Commentary remained cautious, often framed as speculation rather than conclusion. Still, the same question kept appearing in different forms. If the expected destination was never reached, where was the individual actually going? No official clarification was offered, no formal statement was released. Instead, attention turned to secondary details that are often overlooked: transportation records, logistical choices, timing gaps that did not align with the public explanation. These details, while incomplete, created a sense that something was unfolding out of view. By the end of that first night, what began as a missed appearance had turned into a developing narrative, not because of confirmed facts, but because of silence where clarity was expected. And in situations like this, silence has a way of drawing attention. At that point, many people began to watch more closely. To understand why this moment drew such focus, it helps to step back and look at the broader picture that had been forming long before that night. The individual at the center of this discussion had spent years building a public identity that balanced visibility with careful control. Appearances were planned, messages were shaped, projects were introduced with intention. There was always a sense that each move served a larger narrative. That narrative had shifted over time. Early years were marked by traditional roles and formal expectations. Later came a transition toward independence, creative ventures, and private partnerships. This change was widely covered, but it was also widely managed. Public statements emphasized autonomy, growth, and new opportunities. Behind the scenes, a complex network of advisors, representatives, and business structures took shape to support this new phase. Several media projects were announced during this period. Some moved forward quietly, others stalled without explanation. Delays were often attributed to development challenges or changing priorities. In the entertainment world, this is not unusual. Many projects never reach completion. Still, observers began to notice a pattern. Announcements arrived with confidence, but outcomes were often vague. Financial arrangements also became a topic of casual discussion. Contracts were rumored to be substantial, though exact figures were never confirmed. Partnerships spanned multiple countries, and production entities appeared and disappeared with little public footprint. None of this was presented as secretive. It was simply complex, and complexity tends to attract attention when clarity is limited. At the same time, personal circumstances were evolving. Public appearances became less frequent. Statements were shorter and more controlled. Social media activity slowed, then paused altogether. Supporters described this as a healthy step back. Critics saw it as distancing. Neither view was confirmed, and both remained interpretations rather than facts. What is important here is not any single decision, but the environment it created. By the time the missed appearance occurred, There was already an atmosphere of uncertainty, not scandal but ambiguity, not accusation but curiosity. When information is scarce, even ordinary events can take on added weight. Transportation and travel had always been handled discreetly. Private arrangements were common, stifled by security concerns and scheduling demands. This was widely accepted. However, those arrangements followed predictable patterns. When deviations appeared, even small ones, they stood out to those familiar with the routine. Around this time, online communities dedicated to tracking public figures began comparing notes. They were careful with language, often emphasizing that their observations were incomplete. Still, they pointed out that certain choices did not align with past behavior. Routes differed, timing shifted, access points changed. Again, none of this proved anything on its own. Institutional context also mattered. The individual no longer held formal status within the structures that once defined their role. While symbolic connections remained, official authority had been relinquished. This distinction is critical because assumptions often lag behind reality. Public perception does not always adjust as quickly as legal or institutional status. As a result, some privileges that were once automatic were no longer guaranteed. Any continued use of them would require explicit authorization. This is standard procedure, but it is not always understood by the public. In discussions that followed, this detail became central, though no official confirmation was offered at the time. The background, then, is one of transition layered on transition. A public figure redefining their role, business ventures operating across borders, personal visibility decreasing while professional claims remained expansive. None of this implied wrongdoing. It simply meant that the margin for misunderstanding was wide. So when the absence occurred, it landed in a context already primed for questions. The story did not begin with a dramatic event. It began with a long build-up of partial information and quiet changes. The missed appearance was not the cause of concern. It was the moment that brought everything else into focus. And once attention sharpened, it did not fade easily. At this point, many people started asking questions, not because they believed something specific had happened, but because too many details no longer lined up. The discussion stayed careful. Most observers avoided firm claims. Instead, they focused on what could be seen and what could not be explained. One of the first topics to draw attention was timing. The gap between the expected appearance and the last confirmed public movement was wider than usual. Normally, even when plans change, there is some trace of adjustment, a rescheduled meeting, a brief statement, a visible shift in itinerary. This time, there was nothing. The silence lasted longer than expected, and that alone became a point of interest. Transportation records, while incomplete, added to the uncertainty. Some publicly accessible data suggested travel activity that did not match the stated destination. Analysts online were quick to caution that such data can be misleading. Private travel often bypasses standard reporting channels. Still, the same caution did not erase the curiosity. If the original explanation was accurate, there should have been at least indirect confirmation. Attention then turned to the surrounding team. Representatives who were usually responsive became difficult to reach. Messages went unanswered. Scheduled calls were postponed. Again, this did not prove anything. Teams stepped back during sensitive periods all the time, but the timing raised eyebrows, especially given the professional commitments that had been emphasized just days earlier. Financial discussions also resurfaced, not as accusations, but as context. Commentators revisited previously announced projects that had not progressed. They questioned how funds were being allocated and whether development delays fully explained the lack of output. These conversations remained speculative and often ended with the same disclaimer. There was no verified information to confirm misuse or mismanagement. Still, the questions existed. What followed only added to the confusion. A brief sighting, shared anonymously, placed the individual far from the expected location. The image was unclear and could not be independently verified. Some dismissed it immediately. Others noted that it matched the general timing of the disappearance. Without confirmation, it remained an unproven detail, but it circulated widely enough to influence perception. Institutional silence became more noticeable as well. Organizations that might normally clarify status or associations said nothing. No endorsements were reaffirmed. No denials were issued. This absence of response was interpreted in different ways. Some saw it as caution, others viewed it as distancing. Both interpretations were possible, and neither could be confirmed. Legal analysts entered the discussion carefully. They did not suggest wrongdoing. Instead, they explained how cross-border travel, financial reporting, and documentation requirements work in general terms. Their commentary focused on process, not on any individual. Even so, these explanations gave the public a framework for understanding why certain actions, if they occurred, would attract attention. The idea that something procedural rather than dramatic was happening began to take hold. This was not about scandal in the traditional sense. It was about compliance, oversight, and boundaries that often go unnoticed until they are tested. In that light, the situation felt less explosive and more unsettling. As hours turned into a full day, the lack of clarity persisted. Social media, usually quick to react, slowed into a steady hum of cautious observation. Posts used words like possibly, reportedly, and unconfirmed. The tone was measured, almost restrained. People sensed that rushing to conclusions would be a mistake. Still, the pattern was hard to ignore. Missed commitments, unexplained travel indicators, reduced communication, quiet institutional distance. Each element alone was manageable. Together, they suggested that something was being addressed privately, away from public view. This is where the discussion shifted again. Instead of asking what had happened, people began asking why there was no effort to clarify. In high-profile situations, even a minimal statement can stabilize perception. The choice not to do so implies either uncertainty or a desire to limit exposure. Both possibilities invite further attention. Observers also noted the emotional tone, or lack of it. There were no defensive messages, no appeals for understanding, no expressions of frustration. The silence felt controlled, deliberate. That control hinted at legal or strategic considerations, though this remained speculation. As the second day approached, the story did not grow louder. It grew heavier, not because new information had emerged, but because none had. The unanswered questions lingered, creating a space where imagination could easily outpace fact. Most responsible commentators resisted that pull. Instead, they waited. And in that waiting, the sense grew that whatever was unfolding was not meant to be public yet. That realization did not calm the discussion, it deepened it. This is where the situation began to change in a more noticeable way. Patterns that once seemed isolated started to connect, not through hard evidence, but through repetition. Observers noticed that similar gaps had appeared before, though never with this level of consequence. Delayed explanations, quiet schedule changes, projects that shifted without clear reasons. In the past, these moments faded quickly. This time, they did not. The discussion moved away from the individual event and toward behavior over time. Commentators began tracing earlier decisions, not to assign blame, but to understand consistency. When patterns emerge, people naturally look backward to see if signs were missed. This process does not rely on proof, it relies on comparison. One recurring theme was control. The public image had always been tightly managed. Messages were precise, appearances were selective, even criticism was often met with silence rather than response. That approach had worked for years. Silence can be powerful when the narrative is stable, but when uncertainty enters the picture, silence can feel like avoidance, even if it is not intended that way. At the same time, reports surfaced suggesting heightened activity behind closed doors. These reports were vague and came from unnamed sources, so they could not be verified. They described meetings, consultations, and coordination across time zones. No details were offered, and none could be confirmed. Still, the idea that something was being actively managed gained traction. Media outlets tread carefully. Most avoided publishing anything definitive. Instead, they framed their coverage as analysis of public reaction. Articles focused on what was known, which was very little, and on why speculation was spreading. This indirect approach reflected the uncertainty. There was no central fact to report, only a growing awareness that something unresolved was happening. Financial analysts returned to earlier conversations about transparency. Again, they did not accuse. They explained how complex financial arrangements can create confusion when documentation is unclear. They noted that cross-border ventures often face scrutiny simply because of their structure. This context did not confirm any wrongdoing. It explained why attention might increase under certain conditions. What stood out during this phase was restraint. Despite the temptation to escalate, many voices chose not to. Language remained cautious. Words like pattern and trend were used instead of scheme or plot. This careful framing kept the discussion grounded, even as tension grew. Public reaction mirrored this tone. There was no mass outrage, no viral outrage cycle. Instead, there was a quiet unease. Supporters expressed concern without denial. Critics expressed skepticism without certainty. Both sides acknowledged the same thing: too much was unknown. Institutional behavior added another layer. Affiliations that were once highlighted were no longer emphasized. Websites were updated subtly. References were softened or removed. These changes were small and could be routine. Organizations adjust messaging all the time, but in this context, each adjustment was noticed. This gradual distancing did not come with explanation. No one said relationships had ended. No one said they continued. The lack of clarity allowed interpretation to fill the gap. Some saw it as precaution, others as protection. Both interpretations remained unverified. The most telling pattern, according to some analysts, was procedural rather than personal. When systems encounter irregularities, they respond quietly at first. They gather information, they limit exposure, they avoid premature statements. This does not mean a conclusion has been reached. It means a process has begun. That idea resonated with many observers. The situation felt less like a public scandal and more like an internal review unfolding out of sight. The absence of drama was itself the signal. In high-profile cases, drama usually comes later, if at all. As this perspective took hold, the conversation matured. Speculation slowed. Questions became more specific. Instead of asking what happened, people asked what process might be underway. Instead of assigning motives, they considered incentives. Why stay silent? Why avoid clarification? Why allow uncertainty to linger? Possible answers ranged from legal caution to strategic patience. None could be confirmed, but the consistency of silence suggested coordination rather than chaos. That distinction mattered. By the end of this phase, the story had taken on a different weight. It was no longer about a missed appearance or unusual travel. It was about systems responding to something that did not fit expected patterns. That realization did not provide answers. It narrowed the field of possibilities. And with that narrowing came a sense that whatever was unfolding would not resolve quickly. As the days passed, attention began to shift beyond online discussion and into more formal spaces. Public reaction did not explode, but it spread steadily, moving from comment threads into mainstream conversation. Media outlets that had initially stayed silent began to address the situation, though carefully and without conclusions. Their language was measured, often focusing on what was not being said rather than what was. Coverage framed the moment as an open question. Articles avoided direct claims and instead examined the absence of information. Why had no clarification been offered? Why had expected appearances quietly vanished from schedules? These pieces did not accuse. They analyzed. They treated the silence itself as the subject. Institutional responses followed a similar pattern. Organizations previously associated with the individual adjusted their public messaging. Statements that once highlighted partnership were replaced with neutral descriptions. In some cases, references were removed entirely. These changes were subtle and not accompanied by explanation. Officially, nothing had changed. Practically, distance was being created. Public relations experts weighed in, speaking in general terms. They explained how, during sensitive situations, Institutions often limit statements to avoid unintended implications. Silence, they noted, can be a strategy. It can also be a safeguard. Without confirmed facts, speaking too soon can create legal or reputational risk. This framing helped explain the restraint without confirming any underlying issue. The audience response remained divided but calm. Some viewers expressed concern and hoped for clarity. Others urged patience, reminding others that speculation can cause harm. There was no single dominant narrative. Instead, there was a shared recognition that the situation was unresolved. What added complexity was the lack of visible defense. In similar past moments involving public figures, rapid rebuttals were common. This time, there were none. No denials, no explanations, no appeals to misunderstanding. The absence of a counter-narrative allowed questions to linger. Media analysts noted that this approach can be effective when the facts are on your side. It can also be necessary when facts are still being gathered. Without knowing which applied here, the public was left to wait. Institutions known for close ties remained especially quiet. No confirmations of support were issued. No distancing statements were made either. This neutral posture suggested caution rather than judgment. Still, the lack of affirmation was noticed. At the same time, unrelated coverage began to crowd the news cycle. New stories emerged. Attention drifted. Yet this story did not disappear. It settled into the background, resurfacing periodically as new but minor details emerged. Each time it was framed as ongoing and unresolved. This persistence is important. Many controversies fade quickly when there is no new information. This one did not. Its endurance suggested that something procedural was still unfolding, not publicly, but within systems that move slowly and deliberately. By this stage, the discussion had become less emotional and more analytical. People were no longer reacting. They were observing, waiting. The lack of resolution became the defining feature. And that is why the story did not end there. This is why the discussion has not faded, even as days turn into weeks and the flow of public information remains thin. Stories like this usually end in one of two ways. Either clear facts emerge and reset the narrative, or attention drifts elsewhere and the moment is quietly forgotten. What makes this situation different is that neither outcome has occurred. There has been no decisive clarification, but there has also been no return to normal. Schedules have not resumed. Public visibility has not increased. Associations have not been reaffirmed. The pause continues, and pauses at this level rarely exist without reason. For many observers, the enduring interest is not rooted in drama, but in uncertainty. Humans are uncomfortable with unresolved timelines. When an expected sequence is interrupted without explanation, the mind looks for meaning. In this case, the interruption affected professional commitments, institutional relationships, and public presence all at once. That convergence keeps the story alive. Analysts point out that complex matters often unfold this way. Early stages are quiet. Information is compartmentalized. Decisions are made behind closed doors. Public communication is minimized to reduce risk. None of this confirms wrongdoing. It simply reflects how systems operate when stakes are high. There is also the matter of precedent. Similar situations in the past have eventually led to significant revelations, not because the individuals involved were guilty, but because scrutiny demanded resolution. That historical memory shapes expectations even when facts are absent. Another reason the story continues is its symbolic weight. It touches on themes of authority, accountability, and transition. A figure once defined by institutional backing now operates independently. That independence brings freedom, but it also removes insulation. Actions are no longer buffered by legacy structures. This shift raises questions that go beyond one person. The media, aware of this, continues to monitor quietly. Journalists track filings, schedules, and public records, not to sensationalize, but to be ready when clarity arrives. The absence of headlines does not mean the absence of attention. For the public, the waiting has become part of the story. Each day without resolution reinforces the sense that something is pending, that sense does not require confirmation to persist. It feeds on anticipation. Until a clear statement is made or normal activity resumes, the discussion will remain in this suspended state. Not loud, not explosive, just present. And as long as that remains true, people will continue to watch. In moments like this, it is worth stepping back and remembering what is actually known and what is not. There has been no official confirmation of wrongdoing, no formal announcement explaining the silence, no verified account that resolves the questions raised over timing, movement, or decision-making. What exists instead is a space filled by observation, interpretation, and restraint. That restraint matters. It suggests that many involved understand the difference between discussion and declaration. In an era where information moves fast and judgment moves faster, this situation has unfolded at a slower pace. That slowness has shaped its tone. The story feels unsettled not because of dramatic claims, but because of its lack of conclusion. For the public figure at the center of this, the path forward remains unclear. Silence can protect, but it can also isolate. When visibility disappears, speculation naturally fills the gap. The longer the pause continues, the more pressure builds for clarity, even if that clarity is simple and procedural. Institutions, too, face their own calculations. Speaking too early can create risk. Speaking too late can erode trust. Finding the right moment requires confidence that the facts are stable. Until then, distance and neutrality become the default. For the audience, patience becomes the only option. There is no action to take, no side to choose, no verdict to reach. The responsible position is to acknowledge uncertainty and resist the urge to complete the story without evidence. What remains most striking is how quiet this has all been. No dramatic confrontations, no emotional appeals, just an extended pause in a world that rarely stops moving. That pause invites reflection. It reminds us that not every significant development announces itself loudly. Some arrive through absence rather than presence. Eventually, this situation will resolve in some way. Either normal activity will resume, or an explanation will be offered, or new information will surface. When that happens, the narrative will change. Until then, the story exists in this in-between state. And sometimes, it is in that waiting, rather than in the outcome, that the true nature of a moment is revealed.